Hello everyone, today we talk about early and high medieval Caucasian warfare. It's not the first time we enter these times and places. However, we will look at things more from an evidential military point of view through the warfare of the Bagratuni dynasty. Much of the references here are a bit complicated without adequate background. I'll try to be as concisely effective regarding the description of all these subjects. The Bagratuni dynasty, also known as the Bagratid dynasty, actually there is even here further problem because partially a dynasty called like this lasted until the contemporary era, but the Bagratuni period is truly this one arriving fundamentally to the 11th century. We will see the dynastic specificities of it. This was an ancient Armenian princely house with legendary claims of descent just from a sort of psychological, cultural, spiritual standpoint from biblical King David, right? They claimed essentially that there had been this ancestor. They weren't the only ones. I mean, in the West, we did similar things with Troy, with the Achaeans, and so on. Naturally, Armenia being very, these were essentially Miaphysite, Eastern Orthodox. They essentially rejected Chalcedon. There is all the question again of whether to consider sort of the natures of Christ that either fully separated from one another but still present in his person, or like his entire nature being fully divine, fully human at the same time. This is also a relatively convoluted issue that even the same churches realize having very few with in terms of difference of belief in Christ. But we're not going to digress on this stuff. Also because the times are very archaic, are very primitive, especially in the Caucasus, as you understand. These legends are mostly expressing the incredibly imbued sense of Christian identity, but also broader contact with, in this case, a Middle Eastern dimension, of also Jewish legacy, of different siding, different positioning, compared to the Byzantines from one side, the Muslims from the other. So lots of things going. We'll not digress on the religion of Armenia, of Georgia at this point. It is definitely very, very relevant. The legend of Smbat, this ancestor, Shambat, depending on who you want to pronounce it, witness to this ruler allegedly coming from Armenia, probably abducted as a captive from Judea, according to medieval Armenian chroniclers like Moses Korenatsi. The Bagratuni dynasty rose to become the dominant power in medieval Armenia after the mid-8th century, as we will see now, and founded the independent kingdom of, therefore, Bagratid Armenia, debatably depending on which kind of ruler you want to identify as the first, because everything was very fluid and relatively informal regarding sort of fixed institutions in high medieval Armenia, but roughly between 885 and 1045. All right, these are crucial times, as you know, also for the re-expansion of the Byzantine Empire further east, as we were also recently talking in the videos about Basil II. This was also a period often regarded as Armenia's second golden age of cultural, architectural, and political revival from after antiquity, basically, amid balancing Byzantine and Abbasid influences. I have a playlist on medieval Caucasus. It's mostly about warfare, so if you're interested in their sort of fighting styles and their general even arms and armor, material culture, you can check those things out. Today, we give again, a vehemental political, strategical patina to it. The Bagratuni dynasty's path to supremacy in medieval Armenia cannot be understood also without first examining the profound systemic shift caused by the Battle of Bagrevand, also called as the Battle of Artsny, on April the 24th or 25th, that is traditionally, 775. All right. We know much less about Caucasus than we know about the Byzantine Empire. You know that those times were sort of difficult for the world in general. But this battle, in fact, emerges as many of that period as pivotal in affirming, for this reason, also because of the scarcity of resources, and so like the shift, even properly, of strategic power from one side and another, to explain the rise of the Bagratids even ante, all right? In fact, this crucial engagement fought on the open plains near Arsni in the historic province of Bagrevand, that is now in eastern Turkey, near the Aratsani/Araxes River, because you know that historically Armenia arrived pretty far west, almost to the middle of Anatolia. So an Abbasid army of 30,000 elite Khurasani troops, highly skilled forces from the Caliphate's northeastern Khorasan region in the north of Persia, under the Amir ibn Ismail, utterly shattered a major Armenian rebellion against the same caliph, driven by heavy taxation, forced Arab settlements in the Caucasus, and religious pressures. Right? This fact in and of itself is just very fascinating. I recently made a video about the Battle of the Talas River. We've seen how Khorasani troops were present. They were talking just here a generation after the events, and you have this battle-hardened Khorasani troops. This essentially was a Turco-Iranian people that had maintained an incredibly heavy step, and especially Indo-European legacy in a broader spiritual religious point of view, great deal of knightly culture, and were among the finest troops. We never really made a video about Khorasan specifically, but this gives me, of course, an idea for introducing that as well. And the Arabs at this point, like the Caliph of Baghdad, were after the Abbasid so-called revolution, and that was at this point also a truly ecumenic empire rivaling with Constantinople, in spite of the Islamic fragmentation had already started with the Umayyads in the west and further. And this battle is essentially witnessing this universal empire bringing even this provincial, regional actually, force with its finest elite that naturally is at this point essentially subjected to the caliphate to crush a rebellion in the Caucasus. This is one of the most difficultly controllable areas in history. Still today, if you think about it, it's fragmented because of balance of power. We've seen this between the Romans and the Parthians, with the Armenians in between, as a matter of fact. At the time, it was a bit the same, and the Khorasani troops were a bit rougher, sort of more habituated to this kind of brutality. And even though they're not from the Mashrek, like they were habituated to fight against the Persians and so on. And so they're sent in, right? And they managed to score this major victory against the Armenian rebels that with their crosses were resisting against the Islamic tide. It's as brutal as it gets, right? Orographically speaking, again, the Caucasus interland is pure nightmare. Armenians are famous because of their de facto feudal society. Lots of castles situated in almost impregnable places. The Khorasani knew something because of various fortresses scattered along the Caspian Sea and the Elburz Mountains and so on that were considered also impregnable, at least until the Mongols came around. And they were apparently also well provided with iron, right? Metals that were not immediately expendable just because you had them, but that made the Armenian nobility, as we will see later, also pretty courageous and habituated to incredible strains in this high, grounds, really battlegrounds of the time. The uprising had been coordinated by this parapet, that is the supreme commander of the Armenian forces, a hereditary, essentially personal, dynastic, oligarchic office at this point, traditionally held by the Mamikonian house. In fact, this was the most powerful military aristocratic family under the earlier, even our Sassanid kings. I think they're first surely documented by the time of the Sassanians, but we're talking the 4th century AD. And they existed obviously as powerful clans also before. They were famous historically for leading resistances like the one of 451, which is the same year of Chalcedon, by the way, the Battle of Avarai against the Sassanian Persians. They should talk a bit more about Armenian-Persian warfare because it's sort of underrated in that sense, even though, again, most of the were Armenia was a client state of either the Romans or the same Persians. The parapet of this rebellion in 775 was Sbat, has the same name as you've seen from the founder, allegedly descending from King David, Sbat the Seventh Bagratuni, together with the Mamikonian prince Musheg the Sixth Mamikoni. So at this moment, they didn't even hold the office per se, but it was more like the recognition of power. They were siding with this parapet. And the battle of Bagrevand, 775, ended in catastrophic Armenian defeat. It's as if like the apocalypse had arrived. It's the Kosovo polio of the Armenians, so to say, at this time in history at least. But the seventh, Musheg the Sixth, in a very large proportion of the hereditary nobility were killed outright in the battle and or in the aftermath of that. This was a title shift, probably in inner Armenian policy to begin with. The scale of the bloodbath proved really apocalyptic for the Armenian Nakarar class, that, as you know, was essentially the feudal one, like the hereditary high nobility. I say feudal, you can argue para-feudal compared to the following developments of sort of what we call Western feudalism, but these areas in Armenia, Persia were quite right oriented towards that essentially like very, very oligarchic, very landed and encapsulated model with an aristocracy of princely houses that had in fact dominated Armenian affairs since the Arsacid period. So even, from time immemorable, even way before that, as a matter of fact. And these families commanded vast estates, private armies, and key state roles, such as in the Sparapet or the Aspet, for example, that was the master of the horse and crowner of kings. Think about this, that he was essentially the elected by the army to elect the leader, interestingly enough, in deriving power from this equestrian skill, of course. The Armenians had because they were not semi-nomadic people, but they had very good heavy cavalry in that sort of more, again, feudal landed fashion, but also lots of horse archers because of the obvious exposure to the steppes and to the east in general. Some solid infantry, nothing special, but still as retinues of the Nakarat. And it's something similar to what the Sasanians had, telling the truth, in the Mashrek. More or less things worked in the same way. The great princely houses that had, so it's a Kanne of Armenia. Like these great princely houses dated back, as we've seen, even to Arsacid times. And God knows what kind of sources they used at the time that we also don't have anymore, unfortunately, today to assess this. But again, they easily dated back to biblical times. Had long held sway, right? The Mamikonians as traditional military leaders, the Gnuni, the Amatuni, the Rishtuni, Saruni, the Kamsarakan, they were all suffering to the point of annihilation, right? They were effectively wiped out as independent political entities, right? They had held specific lands, watched over by fortifications, and at this point were overrun by the Abbasids and their Khwarezmian troops. While many Armenians perished on the battlefield, many survivors fled into Byzantine exile or clung to existence as dependents of the caliphal administration or the few remaining strong families. The Bagratunis, also called Bagratids, again, although internally divided themselves, because these clans were quite sort of extended, at least fragmented, because power concentration here was a nightmare for everybody involved. This will always remain a frontier, even when controlled by the Muslims. With some branches of the Bagratids, for example, having opposed joining the uprising even, suffered comparatively lighter losses. They withdrew into the mountain refuges of their traditional domains, such as Spertaik and adjacent districts, preserved in this essentially the greatest degree of territorial continuity and military cohesion, and thus emerged from the catastrophe as the only major Nakarar house capable of filling the resulting power vacuum and acting as a rally point for the other few ones standing. The Abbasid caliphs, having repeatedly failed to pacify Armenia through other intermediaries, began to favor the Bagratunis as reliable partners. They could again crush essentially a greater Armenian power concentration when these guys descended from their rocks in inaccessible mountains, and hoping in that sense that to be able to push away the Abbasids and gain more power on their own on the surrounding aristocracies of the region. But again, after even that Armenian bloodbath, it's not, as we just said, yes, the Arabs could come to settle, different colonists occupy certain garrisons, but controlling the hinterland as a whole is a nightmare. So you need to co-opt these subjects, granting them preferential treatment that steadily enhanced the Bagratuni prestige and resources from the mid-8th century onward in particular. Right. So even though they weren't recognized as sort of the formally like as the first rulers, basically it's already from the 8th century that the Bagratuni stood sort of ahead of other Nakarar houses. It was against this background that Ashot Msaker, literally meaning the carnivore, a key early 9th century Bagratuni prince known for his aggressive campaigns to reclaim territories, systematically rebuilt the family's fortunes, also at the expense of other Armenians. And with an Abbasid presence that could do only just so much, but was in a sense also sponsoring them, because other clans still were quite perilous in terms of guerrilla capacity, etc. So it's a bit like what the Mongols did with Moscow back. In the Bagratuni future here, sponsoring them to be more compact at the expenses of surrounding the same connationals. Ashot conducted persistent military operations against the semi-autonomous Arab emirs as well, who had carved out local principalities across Armenia, free of Baghdad's control during the period of direct caliphal rule, while carefully maintaining nominal loyalty to the same caliphs of Baghdad. Through these campaigns, Ashot recovered substantial territories that had belonged to the now extinct Mamikonian house and other diminished families, and he consolidated control over the core districts of Upper Armenia. Around 826, that is, upon his death, Ashot divided these hard-won acquisitions between his two principal sons. Again, there was no way to simply keep things together, especially after such a prominent leader faded. The Armenian noblemen were eager, of course, to parcel out different territories from their father's inheritances, very much like in the typical feudal situation. You have the elder, in this case, son of Ashot, Bagrat II, receiving the strategically vital and economically prosperous principalities of Taron and Sassoon, together with the high title of Ishkanat Ishkan, that is to say Prince of Princes, a bit echoing the King of Kings of the Achaemenid Empire, because basically the standard, also the Abbasid Caliphate, had remained largely also the Persian core of Mesopotamia, plus sort of indirect control over Persia. This formally signified preeminence of Bagrat II among the remaining Armenian nobility, as well as over his younger brothers. But the Confessor, so named for enduring Abbasid captivity without converting to Islam, who was instead granted the northern territories of Spare and Taik, along with the hereditary office of Sparapet, as we've seen traditional, essentially commander-in-chief of the Armenian forces, under the king, however. So a position that, although largely ceremonial under the last Armenian rulers, retained immense symbolic and practical weight. At roughly the same time, a parallel branch of the dynasty had already been established in the Georgian lands of Iberia, that is to say eastern Georgia. I will not describe here too much the deep differences that did exist between two relatively similar people like the Georgians and the Armenians, that also partially overlapped for that matter at convenience. So you see, this was more like the outer place, the frontier, more distant from the Armenian core lands. And this offshoot of Bagratuni control had basically been kept alive by Ashot Msaker's uncle Vasak. This Iberian line, which later evolved into the Georgian Bagratuni dynasty, so the one that, as I was saying before, lived on also in later times, sharing in the same sense the same legendary Davidic origins, etc., and stemming thus also from the same branches that could, as you have seen, be also very autonomous from one another, expanded significantly under Vasak's grandson Ashot I, in fact, usually known as of Iberia, who around 813 obtained Byzantine recognition as presiding prince of that land and received the prestigious court dignity of Kuropalatas, which was, in fact, an imperial title essentially used by Constantinople to co-opt, a bit like as we've seen the caliphs were doing, this distant subjects that here I haven't explained exactly how the Byzantines were reacting to all these changes. Naturally, there was still a claim to those territories. And in general, the Armenians had been very much involved in Byzantine history. As you know, they had historically provided a pretty substantially large amount of troops. Many of them had served also in Islamic armies, but the connection with Constantinople was stronger in many sort of religious, cultural terms. Operating from the fortified base of Tao-Klarjeti, a southwestern Georgian highland region encompassing Tao-Klarjeti and adjacent districts, which became a key Bagratic stronghold and cultural center after Arab incursions pushed the family southward, Ashot I of Iberia restored the ancient castle of Artanuji, traditionally attributed to the 5th century Iberian king Vakhtang I Gorgazali, traditionally because at that point it's just legends rather than his myth, right? But it was equally important to them because they lived exactly of these memories that of course also at the time were much fresher and reliable than we can assess ourselves, encouraging the resettlement of districts ravaged by Arab raids and cholera epidemics, by the way, and actively supported the monastic foundations established by the great abbot Grigol Kansteli. This was a renowned 9th century Georgian monk and founder of numerous monasteries in the aforementioned region, whose efforts transformed it into a major spiritual and intellectual hub. Right, this is a great moment of re-expansion of Eurasian civilization, not so marked as the one of the later centuries as we will see now, but still, right, allowing for further sort of investment, patrimonial strategies. Monasteries were obviously very much like in the West, tied to these various clanic leaders, personal rule, etc. It was a matter of immunity, right? These places could not be as easily attached as sort of castles during the feuds among these Armenian Nakarars. And by the way, of course, the church had also a bit less control of things compared to the Byzantine Empire or the West. But it was also a net that stretched across the region, conferred for sort of spiritual legitimacy to secular authority. So it's really important. And through these combined efforts, Ashot gradually extended Bagratuni authority over a broad territorial sweep that reached from Tao in the southwest through Kola, Artani, Jakavaketi, Samtche, and Trialeti into Shida Kartli in the northeast. You can check with a map what this means, but in any case, it's a pretty consistent provincial dominion. This expansion effectively relocated the political and ecclesiastical center of Georgian Iberia from the Arab-controlled region of Tiflis to the southwestern highlands of Tao-Klarjeti. The formal restoration of Armenian kingship took place under Ashot I, this one of probably Armenia, also known as Ashot the Great, who ruled between roughly 820 and 890. This was the nephew of Bagrat II and grandson of Ashot Msaker. Having been appointed Sparpet in 855 and recognized as Prince of Princes in 862 after the Battle of Karasonk, Ashot pursued a carefully calibrated program of military expansion and diplomatic maneuvering. In 863, he defeated the Kaisite emirs of Manzikert, right, on the Lake Van, the same location, of course, of the famous battle 200 years later, in cooperation with his brother Abbas, who was then serving as parapet. That area is sort of wider. There are, again, but more open grounds, and the Armenians had succeeded in basically regaining them by pushing the Kaisite out. Between 877 and 884, Ashot campaigned against the emir of Barda while maintaining alliance with the Ostikan, that is essentially the Arab governor of Armenia, and he masterfully replaced a disloyal governor in Dvin by sending Abbas to disarm the men and thereby avert full-scale caliphal reprisals. So this was also, again, more of a despoiling of power than an active sort of bloody effort, right, to crush that rule. Ashot annexed Bagrevand in 862 after the final extinction of the Mamikonian house. It had really been left sort of weaker, so once the Islamic rule faded, it could be reseized with the various castles that had somehow remained in spite of the destructions. Also intervened directly in the internal quarrels of the Arsruni family. There was a major surviving Nagarar house that rose in Vaspurakan after 775, claiming from their side an ancient Assyrian royal ancestry, interestingly enough, and becoming one of the most powerful post-rebellion families as well. This happened in the same Vaspurakan. Ashot captured Grigor Derenik, reducing several cantons around Lake Van and releasing him on favorable terms, also securing a durable peace by marrying his own daughter Sophie to Grigor Derenik. As you understand, it's a bit difficult to get a bit more in depth because there is some history, but some of the major events are not even precisely documentable in the details, but you understand there is essentially a broader feudal clanic association. It's all about private, personal alliances with this or that faction leader, and this intermarriage, foundation of monasteries, all in a gradual recomposition of an Armenian power at the detriment mostly of Abbasid power. Ashot strengthened relations with the Siunia house, another prominent Nagarar family in eastern Armenia, ruling the autonomous Sunik province in one of the longest-lasting princely lines, through the marriage of his daughter Mariam to Vazak Gabor IV, supported by the Iberian Bagratunis in their campaigns against Guaram Mampali around 870, and Nasra of Tao-Klarjeti in 881 in alliance with David I Kuropalatas and Adarnaza IV, and suppressed the rebellion of Prince Saak Mle in Vanand at Kars in 888, after previously aiding Adarnaza IV against Bagrat I of Abkhazia in 887-888. When you look at this, you realize that they spent their entire life on horseback, very much like in the Carolingian world, in this feudal society. These cumulative achievements were the sum essentially of relentless warfare, mostly sieges, skirmishes, raids, and also occasionally major campaigns aiming at securing pretty significant footholds. And this activities, military achievements, reached their climax in 884 or 85 when the Caliph al-Mu'tamid, responding to urgent petitions from Armenian princes and ecclesiastical leaders, even because of course the church had a dialogue also with Baghdad, and deeply anxious to prevent Armenia from drifting entirely into the Byzantine orbit, because Ashot was mostly backed by Constantinople, and these other families were worried of his enormous force. well, the Caliph sent Ashot a royal crown, formally acknowledging him as king of the Armenians. And so a title, a co-opting sort of office that was recognized by Baghdad as opposed to Constantinople. Now we're in the Macedonian era, and Byzantine Emperor Basil I extended parallel recognition to Ashot shortly afterward to counter the Muslims. It was always more or less the same old story of Armenia being a client state of both powers at the same time, because the local nobility is so fragmented. And the country is also so big, as a matter of fact. It's so distant from the main centers of the imperial powers that you can't quite ever control it in a direct fashion. Crowned at the fortress city of Bagrevand, Ashot immediately subdued the emir Manas. So he mostly kept siding himself with Constantinople. And in fact, he subdued the emir of Manzikert in 885, consolidating effective authority over Dvin, Manzikert carrying possibly Khoi and Salmas, and established himself as primus inter pares among the Armenian princes, while continuing simultaneously to function formally as an Abbasid vassal and an appointee to the office of Sparapet since 856. This is relevant for different reasons. He keeps, again, siding with the Byzantines. He manages to impose himself, to be recognized by the Armenian nobility as at least the elected military leader of the situation. There is also this detail where, after a couple of generations, the Muslim emirs, sometimes these Muslim emirs were actually Armenians themselves, by the way, had managed to reinstall themselves in Manzikert, interestingly enough. Again, always strategic center. This tells you how fluid the political landscape was. Smbat I, known as the Martyr, that was Ashot I's son, succeeded peacefully in 890 after suppressing an attempt by his uncle Abbas to disrupt the succession. He upheld his father's policy of multi-directional diplomacy, persuading the Ostican Muhammad ibn Abil Saj Afshin that the Armenian-Byzantine alignment would ultimately serve Arab commercial interests as well, right? Because if you pacified Armenia between these two powers, you could have a lot of trade passing across. And naturally, it was a somehow ideal view. At this point, the Bagratunis are predictably getting basically any kind of recognition from anyone as possible, also because these powers are universal, and there is a sort of regional, so in this sense, paradoxically, just Armenian, but universal power in this world. It's as if it was really a world on its own. And naturally, they see themselves as sacred rulers, as you understand here, descending from King David himself. Now, on April the 21st, 892, Smbat achieved one of the most celebrated military successes of the early Bagratuni kingdom by recapturing the historic capital of Dvin from Arab control. This triumph proved ephemeral, though, alarmed by the rapid resurgence of Armenian power that, as we've seen, had tried to sort of massage the caliphs by saying, look, you don't worry, we're your friends, whatever, but actually taking over some of their territory. Afshin retook Dvin, in fact, between 893 and 901. This was, what is interesting about this is even though there were reinforcements coming from Mesopotamia, that is also just like the valleys of the Tigris, Euphrates are very close. We've seen also this in the videos about Manzikert, that technically the Byzantines were arriving there so that you could descend into Mesopotamia at some point once again. Most of this the Ostican's powers, properly the Islamic ruler of Armenia, more or less formally recognized. It's a bit what happens with certain taifas in the mark of Spain, right, of the Umayyad. At this point, like still emirate, will become caliphate soon there, is that most of these powers were truly locally based, right? And they were essentially, you can argue, Armenian to a degree, even though there were lots of troops, as we've seen with the Khorasani before, coming from the outside. And the Armenians themselves used some of these guys. It would be too long just to digress on how they actually were in contact with one another, even though we don't have much documents, but say across the Caucasus and across the Caspian Sea, etc. Of course, there would be important connections and branches of what was developing as the intercontinental Silk Route passing from there. The Ostican Afshin retook the Vin. We don't know when, but we know that between 893 and 901, because by the latter point we know it's in Islamic hands, the Vin is seized by the Arabs back. Also, Zmbat's life was taken as a hostage in the process. You know that heavy fighting was going on. If the Armenian ruler loses his wife, right, in the process, and she would be later exchanged for Zmbat's son, Musheg, and nephew Zmbat, by the way. There is all a sense of sort of divine rule connected with the possession of the woman, as we have described in our videos about traditional religion, so you can imagine all the implications here. Afshin, that is the Armenian name essentially of Abdul-Saj, maintained military pressure until his own death, when in 901 we know that he had reconquered all the territory. His brother Yusuf ibn Abil Sa'id continued the aggressive posture from 901 onward. Zmbat's diplomatic miscalculation, ceding the city of Nakhichevan to the Prince of Sunik, alienated Gagik Arsruni of Vaspurakan, whom Yusuf crowned as independent king Gagik I in 908, the first of, at least as remember, from the name of his domain, thereby, however, at the time creating a truly rival Armenian monarchy. And so you understand that Zmbat's rule had been sort of weaker compared to one of his father. We don't have to necessarily think like this guy was personally worse, whatever. It's like, look at the Carolingian Empire. There's a peak at the beginning of the 9th century. At the end of the 9th century, it fades. Here we are the same era. I don't know what recent video, like for example the one about Charles the Simple, right? That actually was not that bad as a ruler, just like started lacking probably a foundation under his feet for reasons that escaped in part. So there are these moments of expansion and recontraction, and in Armenia things are really unstable. Yusuf's major offensive campaign of 909, coordinated with Gagik, resulted in the poisoning of Zmbat's principal allies. This Islamic coming back is actually occurring also from the opposite end of Europe in the West, so that there are constant ups and downs. So what is technically also a Reconquista war, right? Yusuf devastated the country, besieged Zmbat in the fortress of Berd Kapoet, the Blue Fortress, that's the name, and upon the king's surrender in 914, tortured him to death. At Yazhnjak, beheading him and exposing the headless body on a cross in Vin. Right, this is heavy, and it is really the language that the Armenian frontier speaks from both sides. Like the level of brutality is extreme here, and especially Yusuf champions this, like imposing probably Islamic rule on a war that at this point was warned. Like we are the ones in charge here. We will not let anyone take over. This could have never been possible, by the way, without Armenian support, but the extreme brutality of Yusuf's campaign produced a profound shock among the Armenian princes as a whole. They understood what price was to be paid. It's also just a big cultural issue. These things had happened also in the wars against the same Muslims. Like in the West, you have, I don't know, the Umayyads marching on the shrine of Santiago. Like you have this incredibly intense religious tension that I think modern historiography tends to downplay a little. Gagik Arstruni of Vaspurakan that, as we've seen, had basically bought his crown with Islamic support, at this point withdrew his allegiance from Yusuf, because also Yusuf's destructive campaign had consumed lots of resources. The same Muslims had over the stretch to a degree. And in fact, the same Gagik at this point began active resistance against the Muslims, while Ashot II Yerkat, the Iron, that's the name, Zmat I's son, assumed the throne in the midst of widespread outrage. Yusuf had installed a pretender cousin, so you see always backed by the same Armenians, Ashot Shapuyan as anti-king in Vin, that remember had been reconquered, and so acting as a pawn of the Muslims. Facing occupation of the central lands, Ashot II traveled to Constantinople in 914 to garner help. There, Empress Zoe Carbonospina, I made a video about her for that matter, received him with great honor and dispatched a substantial force under the domestic Leo Phocas. So the situation had been heavily destabilized, and so there was actively a civil war going on in Armenia, and it doesn't matter how powerful the main Bagratuni dynasty had been, Ashot II could not reestablish his reign without Byzantine support. Right. That Byzantine Armenian force entered Taron in 915, encountering scant opposition, and inflicted severe casualties on Arab contingents found along the way in the various garrisons, although winter conditions finally prevented an advance on Vin itself. The intervention, however, still restored Ashot's position and inaugurated a protracted civil war that lasted further from 918 to 920, ending with the defeat and submission of the pretender, as we've seen the cousin propped up by the Muslims. Yusuf's own failed revolt against the Caliph in 919 led to his replacement by the more conciliatory Subuk, who in 922 formally recognized Ashot as legitimate ruler and conferred upon him the Persian-style title Shahanshah, which, as we said before, actually echoed a bit with the Armenian. We used Prince of Princes. This was King of Kings, so that there was basically a stall, a condition of power sharing that happens when both sides are exhausted. Ashot II here at least secures part of his nominal rule. Byzantine unease over Ashot's improving relations with the Abbasids are also a problem from the other side. This prompted the general John Kurkuras to launch assaults on Dvin in 922 and again around 927-928. Both operations failed due to the combined defense mounted by Arab and Armenian forces. So the Byzantines thought that they could use Ashot as a Trojan horse into Armenia. Instead, basically, they realized like the hard rule of this clans, this mob that is always like is able like to make the worst alliances in terms of sort of ideological, moral, spiritual coherence, but still preserving their land, because they had learned the hard way how they had to get through hell in order to rise to heaven, right? The Byzantines were not there even just for beneficence, so to say, charity. And Yusuf released from captivity even in 923 renewed tribute demands and launched further invasions. At this point, it was personal, because as we've seen, his brother and him had sort of managed to humiliate the Armenian monarchs. He had also lost power because of them, and sort of prison is a mark there. Ashot repeatedly defeated and routed the Arab armies, however, sent against him over the course of several years until Yusuf's death in 929 amid the ensuing power struggle among rival Iranian and Kurdish families in Azerbaijan arose. During the same period, we're essentially during the 20s of the 10th century, Ashot executed one of his most celebrated strategic operations near Lake Sevan. He deliberately lured Arab forces there into a vulnerable position, then deployed highly skilled Armenian archers in boats who unleashed devastating, precise volleys into enemy camps gathered along the shore, naturally, this is, again, mythological as anecdotal information, because, again, there were legends that were later recorded into factual, or into chronicles that were supposed to talk about factual history. We've seen what a disaster already, I don't know, Hungarian manuscript tradition was, as far as the historical credibility thing. You can imagine how, things happen in the Caucasus to begin with. Now, the Armenians, we've seen also in the videos about medieval Caucasian warfare, from their iconographic sources, illumination, have a lot of beautiful art and, in fact, interesting documents, sources, etc. But obviously, like, there is always this degree already of more Eastern symbolism of sort of rounding up. There were all kind of these tactics in the form of ambushes, commando, sort of amphibious incursions. Like in this case, it's absolutely plausible, right? But warfare was also much more about specific sort of combined arms coordination, battle lines, open field engagement. So assaults on camps when the enemy was caught by surprise did happen. Allegedly, this is what happened here. The enemy broke and fled in disorder, allowing Ashot to clear the central and northern regions of foreign invaders. We're talking the 10th century, right? The material poverty of the world in general is staggering. As you can imagine, taken by surprise, and any army annihilating it, even if, I don't know, thousands of men had been sort of captured, scattered, in any case, killed, across this territory. It would have been a major blow, very difficult to absorb, if not in a generation, from kind of Arab forces. By the way, in the aftermath of this victory, Ashot also captured Yusuf's family, compelling their submission and forcing formal acknowledgement of his authority. It's interesting, of course, how, like, as an agent of the caliphate, these families, even in a personal sense, right, in a symbolical sense, would still confer authority to Armenian rule to a degree. And that's also obvious because the caliphate was literally next door. And these repeated victories earned Ashot the enduring epithet Yerkat, the Iron, as we were saying before. Abbas I, who succeeded in 929 and established his court at the fortress city of Kars, presided over an unusually stable and prosperous interlude that Armenia had not experienced for decades, at least apparently. Right? He persuaded the Islamic governor of Dvain to release Armenian hostages and restore control of the pontifical palace to the Armenian church. Apart from a military setback near Vagarshat, Arab military pressure remained minimal during his reign. So there were actual clashes, and this would never really end. But still, there was an important equilibrium. Abbas was markedly less trusting towards the Byzantines at this point, whom he regarded as unreliable allies after repeated territorial annexations in the west, which makes sense also because the Byzantines are creeping back as a more truly ecumenic power, and they're particularly capable of regaining control in a methodic way of this and that fortress along the way. Distance to Armenia that is very far, right? This is something we've seen also in the videos about Manzikert talking right around there. You think, well, not all the Armenians are close, but they're like 1,000 kilometers inland, right, from the central Anatolia to the center of Armenia. By the way, with the communications of the time, etc. So we're talking probably another world in so many ways. In 943, Abbas confronted an invasion by the Abkhaz king Ber, who appeared with an army along the Araxes, demanding that a newly completed church in Kars be consecrated according to the Chalcedonian rite, because those guys actually were, in fact, probably Chalcedonian, or like the Byzantines. So this was a way to exact tribute in practice, political prestige, and all what came out of that sort of orientation ecclesiastical policy. Abbas refused any concession, ambushed Ber's forces at dawn, captured the king after several additional skirmishes, blinded him, and sent him back to Abkhazia. That seemed like a pretty good message to send back to those guys. Ashot III, enthroned in 953, transferred the royal capital of the Bagratuni, of capital we can speak, by the way. They had itinerant courts, but just there was sort of greater preference for this or the other. In fact, to Ani. We are in 969. Ani, now a ruined UNESCO World Heritage Site in eastern Turkey near the Armenian border, was an ancient fortified city on a triangular plateau with strong natural defenses from surrounding ravines, strategic position on the major trade route connecting Dvin to Trebizond, right? So Black Sea trade, as a matter of fact, and became one of the medieval world's most splendid urban centers, often called the city of 1001 churches, though the actual number was obviously lower, because there wasn't sort of no overwhelming urban civilization could be sustained in Armenia to begin with. It's a bit like what we were saying in the previous videos last week about the overstatement of Byzantine civilization, etc. You have people, buying any kind of hyperbole. But in any case, this is still a moment of recovery. Also, on the wake of a gradual sort of decline of the same Abbasid world, a bit more of further civilizational injection from Constantinople, right? The center was, in any case, known for its architectural richness during Armenia's golden age, with big population that was estimated at over 100,000, but is highly unlikely to have actually ever been reached. In any case, there were big centers. Ashot III was crowned Shan Shah himself at Argina near Ani in the presence of military contingents, 40 bishops, the king of Caucasian Albania, and Catholicos Anania Mokatsi. There was an establishment of neighboring peoples tributing honors, etc. We'll talk more about Caucasian Albania. I already made actually a video about that for the later Middle Ages, its warfare, etc. Ashot immediately began fortifying Ani with the famous Ashotashan walls and sponsored an ambitious building program that included monasteries, hospitals, schools, and almshouses. His wife, Khosrow Vanuish, founded the monastic complexes at Sanahin in 966 and Hagpat in 976. In foreign affairs, Ashot III was largely successful. When Byzantine Emperor John I Tzimisces entered Taron in 973, ostensibly to avenge the death of his domestic killed by the Arabs in Mosul, Ashot mobilized an army of allegedly 80,000 men. Of course, would have never been there. Here, basically, we could think it's even 1/10 of that, and compelled the emperor to withdraw. Right. See, this was happening because of, again, the Byzantine attempt to use Armenian politics to infiltrate the country and dislodge there the Islamic presence that, however, served the Armenians to sort of shield themselves from the same Byzantine predations, as they maintained their own religion by all this. So you can understand the perspective. In 974, Ashot III concluded an alliance with the Saint Tzimiskes that sort of, in the sense, backed down, but in exchange of the promise of allegedly 10,000 Armenian troops serving the Byzantine army against the Islamic Emirates in Aleppo and Mosul. It's absolutely well possible, again, that there were, as always, historically. I also made a video about the Armenian auxiliaries, 2 videos actually, one together with the other ethnicities during this period, essentially between the 6th and the 11th century, and one probably about the Armenian infantrymen of this era, how it would have looked like. Nothing special in terms of equipment, telling the truth. It was because auxiliaries tended to be lighter. There would be aristocrats, heavy cavalry, Nakahar class with their retinues and so on, but here even 10,000 Armenians, it's definitely too much if they are sort of just like Ashot saying, okay, Armenians, you can't go serve the Byzantines also just for plunder, whatever. It's one thing. If we're talking his personal contribution, I don't think they would have been more than 1,000. All right. And it would have worked well. Also because it's quality that matters at war rather than just quantity in general. A prolonged siege of Dvin, then held by the Shaddadids, was undertaken by Ashot in 953, but ultimately had to be lifted due to the strength of the defenses. Again, very impervious territories just to wage war in, aside from the formidable strongholds that existed here. This was an important center to begin with, required really lots of troops to encircle it, to surround it, to create some volume and so on. A notable innovation of Ashot III's reign was the deliberate creation of sub-kingdoms within the Bagratuni realm. This was not really much of a creation per se. It was basically the bestowal of power to some key figures close to him. In fact, he installed his brother Musheg as king in Kars, Vanand, and granted the administrative district of Zoraget near Lake Sevan to his son Gurgen, progenitor of the Kiurikid line. This was a junior branch of the Bagratunis that ruled the northern kingdom of Tashir, Zoraget, or Lori, semi-independently from the late 10th century, in fact, at this point, until the 12th, with centers like Hagpat and Sanahan monasteries. And the same Gurgen later assumed the royal title. The prosperity and cultural flourishing of the Bagratuni kingdom continued unabated under Smbat II, who reigned between 977 and 89, who ordered the construction of a second outer circuit of fortifications around Ani, known as the, in fact, Batashan walls, to accommodate the city's rapid urban expansion. Gagik I, who reigned after him until 1020, maintained this stability. However, the long-term trend was ominous. Byzantine Emperor Basil II systematically advanced eastward at this point. He's famous also for his Armenian campaigns. Taron was annexed outright by the Byzantines in 967, after the death of Ashot Bagratuni, that ruled from that city. As we've seen, the Byzantines had been after for quite a long time. Ashot Bagratuni's sons Gregory and Bagrat could not withstand imperial pressure either. The Arsruni kingdom of Vaspurakan followed in 1021, when Sennacherib Hovannes, facing devastating Turkmen raids, offered Basil II his entire realm, including 72 fortresses and thousands of villages, in exchange for lands centered on Sebastian Byzantine Cappadocia, to which he relocated in 1021 with his family and approximately 14,000 retainers, allegedly. More like subjects if they were, otherwise it would have been like maybe 1400. This is very interesting. From the name Sennacherib Hovannes, it's a mix between Assyrian and Christian name, and as we've seen with Jewish ascendances, and also the Armenian script is quite a thing on its own. You understand what kind of melange of cultures Armenia is, right? Basil II, we will talk more about Basil II campaigns in the East, right? They were relentless, and definitely something is cracking here, right? It's as if the same Byzantine Empire is actually expanding greatly again after the death of Basil II, contracting. Once again, we'll understand now, in fact, better what happened in the Armenian frontier after his death. But in any case, many Armenians are displaced by this expansion, and there is no cohesion essentially to withstand the imperial onslaught, right? After Gagik I's death around 1020, the core Bagratuni kingdom split between his sons. Hovannes Smbat received Ani and the western territories, while Ashot IV the Brave was intended to hold the eastern lands, including Dvin. So essentially the core, the more developed areas, also the ones closer to Constantinople, that in any case, aside from its offensives, was pouring sort of civilizational depth. From the Mediterranean side, in general, things were more developed. In the East, it was more like a frontier and more destabilized. I made some videos, by the way, about Azerbaijan as well, like starting from, as we'll see now, also the arrival of the Seljuks, to also later times, Mongol era. You can understand how the Caucasus is split fundamentally into different sides, one more in the east pertaining to Iran, and the other having to do, in fact, much more with the Byzantines, with the Mediterranean world, or at least the Black Sea. Now, Dvin had already been seized, however, by the point of the aforementioned partition by the Shaddadid Emir Abu al-Azwar Shavur ibn Fadl. So Ashot IV's effective domain was severely limited in this eastern theater. Realize that, of course, these various Islamic dynasties in the north were very autonomous, were very actually connected with the autochthonous establishment. In many ways, they were just like some local competitors more than, at this point, like the so-called Islamic Golden Age is fading, right? The same model of sort of centralized state sort of bureaucracy professional is collapsing. The same Byzantines will gradually, like during the 11th century, as we've seen in many videos, basically collapse towards an ever more oligarchic and privatistic system. I made a video also about the overextension of Byzantine territory, especially the exhaustion of resources after Basil II's era of relentless warfare. This part would have impacted the Armenian frontier as well, from both sides. Now, the two brothers in control, the Bagratuni dynasties, spent their reigns in bitter territorial quarrels, which definitely is not a good omen. Under intense pressure from Basil II in his later reign, Hovhannes Zbat sent Catholicos Petrus Gethadarj to Constantinople in 1022 and pledged that the kingdom would pass to the empire upon his death. After the brothers' deaths in 1040-41, the new emperor Constantine IX, I made videos about all these emperors, by the way, if you're interested in follow the line. I also have another incoming exactly on the mid-11th century. So the worst times in Byzantine history, or at least one just sort of stagnant or actually declining, say, aura of stability, right, before the hurricane, before the storm. Constantine IX claimed the inheritance, right? You understand that this was all technically nominal, right? Because regardless of, powerful rulers, conquests, etc., this place was far away. You needed to, you could even launch an expedition there, but effectively what changed was that you would conquer this or that fortress, and you had to garrison that, adding to the cost, still run basically by local. You had to install their garrisons, but professional soldiers paid as sort of ever more elite elements. Then you had still local levies that were Armenian themselves, so it's very complicated. Now, Gagik II Ashot IV's young son ascended with the support of Sparpet Varam Palavuni and his followers, despite internal pro-Byzantine intrigue led by overseer Sargis Hai Kazan. Gagik repelled a Turkmen attack in 1041-1042. At this point, the Turks are really pressuring the frontier. Gulams are present in Caliphal armies since ever. Like, technically also the same Romans had been using Turks at some point in their history. So as you've seen before also with the Khurasani, the Armenians had known that pretty much harshly from the 9th century at the latest, but that there had been other Turkic war bands around. The problem at this point is that the same Arab world is giving way to that. Also, the Byzantine world is starting to waver. And this is not good news for Armenia. It is largely dependent, as we've seen also, on this external civilization. Now, in 1042, Varam Palavuni crushed a Byzantine army reportedly numbering, well, from the sources, of course, 100,000, which would have not been more than 10,000, let's be realistic, before the walls of Ani, routing the invaders with enormous casualties in any case, and allowing Gagik II's coronation in the cathedral. So the Byzantines try, again, to influence these new Armenian rulers. The Bagratuni dynasty here has issues. It's essentially about to melt away, as we will see now, but there is no way to properly control the new characters. Yet, Byzantine diplomacy combined with Petrus Getadar's treachery and the young king's political experience would prove fatal. In fact, after two unsuccessful Byzantine invasions of Ani in 1044, Petrus, governing the city in Gagik's absence, surrendered Ani to the empire. We are in 1045. The city was incorporated into the theme of Iberia, which was renamed Iberia and Ani as a consequence, just to please the local establishment. The fall of Ani in 1045 marks the end of the main Ani branch of the Bagratunis. And so we say basically the Bagratuni kingdom of Armenia stops at this point, even though, again, these branches would live on for several centuries, because they were also married to one another, right? This was also normal for the previous Armenian nobility. There is a major crack in the institutional continuity of this realm. Right, the junior Kars branch held out against the Byzantines until 1064-1065, when Gagik Abbas was compelled to cede his lands to the Byzantines and retreat to Anatolia, only for Kars itself to fall to the Seljuks shortly afterward. If you're interested, I made a video that illustrates how Manzikert alone did not cause the fall of Anatolia. It was the Byzantines displacing the Normans that I have been using in this theater, by the way, up to then from Amazeia, that allowed for the Turks to swarm in. Ask Alexius I Komnenos, who was sent from Constantinople before becoming emperor naturally at that point, to do so. And when he was coming back across Anatolia, the Turks had literally surpassed him and had plundered his family house in the countryside. So it's terrifying. It's a moment of collapse at large. And it's not like the Byzantines are actually pushing very forward. This is a moment when you realize that at Manzikert, again, the Byzantines had really arrived up to there, and they were now to threaten to invade Mesopotamia and so on. So they had been successfully consolidating the frontier, as unstable as it could be, but still enough to basically nullify the resistance of any broader, in this case, Bagratuni domain as such. And so mostly this was, again, possible because the Armenians allowed it. As always, without the decisive moral majority of the subjects here, you can't work. We see, in fact, these other branches holding out. For example, the Q-Rikit branch continued to rule the independent kingdom of Tashir Jorget, as we said before, until 1118. We're already in the Komnenian era. We're skipping all what happens in between, because we will talk more, and because it ends on 1045. So all the Manzikert thing, etc., it happens later, right? It actually is enabled by the fall of the Bagratuni. This Q-Rikit branch maintained also smaller principalities centered on fortresses such as Tavush and Masnaberd until the Mongol conquests of the 13th century. If you're interested, I really suggest you to Google the places that from the names, because it really shows you how it still is today. It could be in the 11th century with these fortresses, monasteries, this sort of breathtaking landscapes in the mountains and so on. But it's also a pretty dark place if you realize what was going on. The Bagratid military system rested on feudal levies raised by the Nakarars, as we've seen, capable of mastering allegedly from up to 50,000 men under a strong king, even though it's just nominal. We don't have evidence of any sort of larger force than a few tens of thousands at most, and it was completely useless for them to mobilize it most of the time. So the smaller contingents were easier to move. There was no way to crush the local nobility. Also because, as you've seen from the map, it's an incredible. Today we made it easily, but it's an incredibly intricate set of sceneries that stretch over this incredibly complicated geography, and so it was impossible to simply command to everything. For the sake of warfare, talking about battles, the sort of these forces, we know very few about them, admittedly, but they would be organized in classical dispositions with an avant-garde, a center supported by flanking units, and a rear guard. This is optimally what you see also throughout later centuries in different moments. They could fight different ways, but at least the field army kind of pitch battle array, right, would mostly look like that. That's also what the Byzantines more or less had, with the same foes of other peoples most fought even though there were specifically sedentary-looking forces, right? So they were well structured, heavy. They had strong cavalry, but they were mostly on foot, differently from, say, the Seljuks that fought largely like the Mongols on horseback, right? So they had sort of slightly different. They had actually very similar arrays, but they function in relation with these other ones on the battlefield in very different ways. And especially the classical structure functioned effectively when the suzerain could enforce discipline and unity among vassals. Political cohesion is the best guarantee of military victory. However, this is exactly the point. And also you realize how relatively ephemeral the Bagratuni dynasty itself was in, or at least as a kingdom proper. Like, yes, it was very powerful, but at some point there was this surge and then a collapse once again. It's because of the proliferation of sub-kingdoms, the constant centrifugal pressure of noble autonomy from within the same Bagratuni house, relentless Byzantine exploitation of internal divisions. At the end of the day, the Byzantines proved stronger than the Caliphate, and the arrival of the Seljuk Turks that ultimately rendered the kingdom indefensible. One can, of course, sort of revisit this period further because it's very interesting, as you understand, and there are really lots of sort of different aspects to say. There is, again, a very good. I mean, for the times and places, we know some interesting things, really. Certain things will never be fully known, but we can also kind of reconstruct them to an extent. And so it's incredibly interesting to look at this stuff and realize how all these various regional cradles had their own story. And that's why we make these videos to begin with. I'm really glad to have done this because sometimes these ideas come into my mind and say, do I talk about this or not? Will they watch it? I don't care much about the views, as you have realized. I have, at this point, this is the 9th video made on medieval Caucasus, so you can actually check out a playlist on it, and I hope to enlarge it because it's really a region that deserves a lot of attention, and I think this was an important chapter between the 9th and the 11th century in particular of Armenian history that is worth appreciating. We will look at some point at some battles, historical military units, everything, like the whole package. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.